Hello, this is Dennis Martin, and welcome to another session in our study of the Gospel of Matthew. We're in the second half of the 27th chapter of Matthew this time, and we're talking about Jesus' crucifixion. As we left in our previous session, Jesus had been sent by Pilate to be crucified, and Matthew passes kind of quickly by. It says Jesus was scourged and beaten and then sent to be crucified. Uh, it's really much more serious than it sounds like in the way Matthew describes it. The scourgings were beatings with a whip with multiple thongs on it, each of them tipped with something sharp, bone or metal or glass. They cut the flesh, sometimes to the bone, sometimes even tearing it off, and oftentimes prisoners actually died from that punishment before they were ever crucified. So Jesus is beaten really almost to death, just in just a couple words that Matthew uses. It is fitting with his his use of the Old Testament and including details that are specific in documenting Old Testament, the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies, and this one in particular from Isaiah 53, and we'll look at Isaiah 53 more as we go along. Matthew doesn't include a lot of the details that are found in some of the other Gospels, but what he does include is there for the purpose of showing that Jesus is the Messiah predicted in the Old Testament. His point now seems to be as Jesus is taken by Pilate's soldiers into the praetorium and mocked for a while. First, it seems to sort of balance in the story that Jesus has been mocked by the Jews. Now he is mocked by the Gentiles, and again, Isaiah seems to be thinking of the Old Testament, and in particular of Isaiah 53. Now, the soldiers of the governor were not necessarily regular Roman legionnaires, but they often were local mercenaries, irregulars, recruited from Israel's neighbors, from the Syrians, from the Phoenicians, maybe from the Samaritans, and those people did not think very much of the Jews. They had little love for the Jews, and so the opportunity to mock and torture and kill this person who had been calling himself the King of the Jews was probably something that excuse me, that they could participate in wholeheartedly. It says the whole cohort came out. The cohort's 500 or 600 men, and all of them were there. They put a scarlet robe on him, a soldier's cape, in mockery of the king's purple robe. They put a reed in his hand in mockery of a king's scepter, and then, of course, they put the crown of thorns on his head, and they spit on him. They beat him in the head and the face with the reed, and in general they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," as they would have said, "Hail Caesar." After that was finished, they dressed him in his own clothes, and then were going to take him out to crucify him. Normally, criminals were let out naked to be crucified, but because of the Jews' sensibilities to nakedness, Jesus' clothes were put back on. But it still is very cruel. Jesus, as I said, had been beaten almost to death. The condemned prisoner was generally forced to carry his cross or part of his cross. Often it would the upright part of the cross was left at the place of execution to be used over and over and over again by succeeding criminals who were killed. But they would carry the cross beam of the cross. Still, that was extremely heavy, weighing anywhere between 75 and 125 pounds. Think of a small railroad tie. And so even if that was what he had to carry rather than to drag his cross, it was extremely heavy for a man who's been almost beaten to death, who's been up more than 24 hours, who's dehydrated, who has lost a lot of blood. And the traditional route from the praetorium, where the soldiers were, out to Calvary, to Golgotha, is almost a half a mile that he would have had to have walked. And so very soon he was not able to do that. As the text says, as they were coming out, they found a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they pressed him into service to bear his cross. The Roman soldiers could simply point to a person in the crowd and say, "You come here, you do this," and they have the authority to do that. And the person they found was Simon of Cyrene, probably a Jew, probably someone who had come to Jerusalem for the Passover. Often Jews and Cyrene was on the northern coast of Africa, so it's a long ways away. Often Jews throughout the empire would maybe be able to come to Jerusalem once or twice in their lifetime to be able to celebrate the Passover. And so he is here in Jerusalem probably on a once-of-a-lifetime experience, and he's singled out by the Roman soldiers that just say, "You come carry the cross," and there's nothing he can do except obey, or they can kill him too. Mark's gospel adds a few more details. As I said, Matthew includes just the details he needs to show us pretty clearly from prophecy who Jesus is. Mark says they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. There's an interesting line there where he says the father of Alexander and Rufus. You need to know something about Mark's gospel, and that what Mark is probably writing the gospel, so the gospel according to Peter's recollections and Mark's own, but also a gospel probably directed toward the church at Rome. And it's interesting to look at the end of Paul's letter to the Romans, a generation later, where he, in the 16th chapter, has greetings to a number of different people. He also says, "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who has been like a mother to me too." It's interesting to think of Mark writing his gospel for the church at Rome and saying, when Jesus was going out to carry his cross and he stumbled and fell, they pointed to Simon. Simon's the father of Alexander and Rufus. You know them. And it was his father that they asked to carry Jesus' cross. That this is very real. This was very personal. So Simon carried his cross. They carried it to outside the city to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And again, Matthew's mostly interested in what the event means, not all of the details. And sometimes the details, they may or may not be in the other gospels, but the details are there to show the fulfillment of Old Testament scripture and prophecy. So they're at Golgotha, and they crucify him. It says they gave him wine to drink mixed with gall, and after tasting it, he was unwilling to drink it. The drink was probably intended to dull pain. Both the Talmud and Proverbs talk about wine mixed with incense, and Mark says instead of wine mixed with gall, wine mixed with myrrh. But Matthew uses the exact words that are in Psalm 96. and actually quotes the Septuagint here to show even this is a fulfillment of prophecy. Now, it actually, if it was to dull pain, was an act of kindness in a sense by the Roman executioners. But Jesus refuses. He refuses to have his pain reduced. He is going to bear it all as part of the mission that he came to perform. The next verse says, they crucified him and they divided up his garments among them by casting lots. It was traditional that the execution squad received the belongings, meager belongings often, of the condemned criminal. And so it's just sort of an incidental detail, but Matthew includes it because it's part of the prophecy of Psalm 22. And, in this few short verses, there are three prophecies from three different parts of the Old Testament that Matthew includes the fulfillment of. Then the charge that was above his head, in this case, the King of the Jews, is a regular part of crucifixion. Sometimes the condemned criminal was forced to carry the sign around his neck. Sometimes a person would walk before him as he was being led out to be executed with carrying the sign. And then the sign was placed on the cross too. The other Gospels say the sign said this in three languages. In fact, sometimes the wording says, "This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." It was in Hebrew and Greek and Latin. And John makes the mention that this causes a complaint from the chief priests. They say to Pilate, don't say he is the King of the Jews, say he said he was the King of the Jews. And John says, Pilate responded with, "What I have written, I have written." And Pilate's probably getting kind of tired of this whole thing by now. But it's one final declaration of who Jesus is, and Pilate made sure that it said Jesus was the King of the Jews in Hebrew and Greek and Latin. And then Jesus is crucified between two thieves. Matthew doesn't give us any more in terms of details than that, but this is important because Matthew sees it as a fulfillment of Isaiah 53. We'll talk a little bit about what was crucifixion. Crucifixion was a particularly cruel and painful form of public execution. The intention was not just to punish people as painfully as possible, but also to show everyone else who was watching, this is what will happen to Rome's enemies. So you need to be careful what you do. It was reserved for slaves. It was reserved for the worst and the lowest forms of criminals and for enemies of the state. But it could not be used on Roman citizens. It was considered too degrading and too cruel for Roman citizens. If they were executed, they were beheaded, as was the Apostle Paul. But those who were not Roman citizens could be crucified, and especially in places like Palestine, when the Romans were ruling it, it was relatively common. And the authors in the first century agree that it was a very terrible and thought to be a disgraceful way to die. The victim had often been beaten severely, as Jesus was before he was crucified. Then they're forced either to drag the whole cross or carry the crossbeam to the place of execution. They would have this sign with the list of all of their charges while they are being executed, either hung around their neck or carried before them. Then they're stretched out on the ground. They're nailed to a piece of wood using huge wrought iron stakes about the size of railroad spikes, although maybe a little longer. And the idea of nailing a person to a board is of doing that to a human being is just sort of repulsive. Then the person is lifted into the air and suspended between heaven and earth here. Often they were naked, although not necessarily in Palestine, as I'd said. Their feet are also nailed to the cross. Sometimes their hands are tied so that their wrists are tied to the cross beam also with ropes so that the nails won't pull out and they would fall down and you'd have to start over again. But they hang there until they die either from loss of blood or from asphyxiation, just hanging in agony. And sometimes they hang there for several days before they finally died. This shows that there were really two kinds of crosses that were used in Jesus' day in Palestine by the Romans to crucify people. The more common is sort of a T-shaped cross. And in either of these, but especially with the T-shaped cross, the main upright piece could stay at the execution site. The victim would be forced to carry the cross beam for his own execution, or her own execution, because women were crucified too, and then stretched out on the ground, nailed to the cross beam. It would be lifted up and hung to the upright piece. Then their feet would be nailed to the upright. On the right of this particular slide, there's an example of what the wooden sign of the charges would have been, and here it's written in Hebrew and Latin and then Greek. So there was this T-shaped cross, but there was also what's called a Latin cross, which is more what we think of in terms of a cross, with the upright going above the cross piece. And it's not known exactly which one of these was used to crucify Jesus, but because it talks about the charges being hung above his head, people think that it's the Latin cross with the raised with the raised centerpiece above the cross piece, but we don't know for sure. Another thing that's interesting about this is, as it says in this picture, sometimes that upright piece on which the cross piece was hung was not very tall. This says 6 to 8 feet. Often we see pictures with Jesus and the two thieves, and they're way up above the heads of everyone watching them. Their feet seem to be about at eye level of the crowd standing around. If Jesus really was crucified on a cross that's only 8 feet tall, think of the 8-foot high ceilings in your home. His head would have only been a foot or two above those who were standing directly in front of him, mocking him, spitting on him, perhaps touching him or even beating him there, saying, "Come down from the cross if you're really the Messiah." Matthew then, as part of his description of the crucifixion, again includes more and more examples of Old Testament prophecy that are being fulfilled. From Psalm 22 and from Psalm 109, he talks about people passing by saying, "Come down from the cross, save yourselves." People saying that he saved others, he can't save himself. If he's the King of Israel, let him come down, then we'll believe him. He trusted in God, let God rescue him if God really cares for him. And all of these are from the Old Testament in prophecy of what will happen to Messiah as as Matthew points out. Verse 40 refers to that charge of the false witnesses. And Jesus had also mentioned this, of course, to his disciples, but not very often in public. But even in their mockery of Jesus, they still continue to refer to him as the King of the Jews. The robbers even insult them. Yet for this first part of his crucifixion, Jesus remains silent, and Matthew also points out that this is part of the prophecy. It's like a sheep before its shearers is dumb, so he did not open his mouth. But then later in the crucifixion, Jesus is no longer silent. The crucifixion probably began around 9 o'clock in the morning, according to Mark's gospel. Matthew doesn't really tell us much about the time in that early part of the crucifixion. He does talk about at the 6th hour darkness fell. 6th hour is about noon, and the 9th hour is 3 o'clock. And darkness was over all of the land. He mentions the darkness because darkness in the Old Testament is a sign of the displeasure of God. It's also one of the plagues of Egypt, showing God's judgment upon people who have forsaken him or turned their backs on him. Matthew sees Jesus' words of my God, why have you forsaken me?" as a direct quotation of the first verse of Psalm 22:1. And Jesus, of course, knows the scripture better than Matthew and better than any of us. So Jesus also speaking these words does not speak them as an accident, but they have a deep meaning here, and talk about the extreme amount of suffering Jesus is going through. The suffering that is being described here is not just the suffering of being beaten, of the loss of blood, of being whipped, literally stripping flesh from the body, and then being nailed literally to a piece of wood. But the suffering that he's describing here is being separated from God. For the first time in his life, for the first time in his existence, Jesus is separated from the Father because he has upon himself all of the sins of humanity for all time. From the beginning to the present to the future, the sins of all humanity are on him, and it separates him from God. God turns his back on those sins, and because they are on Jesus, God turns his back on Jesus. It's also significant that this is the only time in Matthew's gospel that Jesus does not address God as Father. He just says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And many say that this is much more painful for Jesus than all of the physical pain involved in crucifixion. That the idea of being separated from God, where never before in eternity or never again will that happen, is almost more than he can bear. Then there is another drink, and Matthew includes that because it's referred to in Psalm 69, and Jesus does take a drink this time. The thought is perhaps so that he can speak loudly at the end, because before Jesus dies or as the text says, yields up his spirit. Matthew tells us he cries out with a loud voice. Matthew doesn't tell us what he said. But the other gospels, some of them do. But first of all, a loud cry at this time is very unusual for crucifixion. Basically, what happens in crucifixion is the person suffocates to death. Each time, in order to breathe, they must pull themselves up with their arms and push themselves up with their legs in order to breathe. And eventually, and as I said, it could take days, but eventually they are no longer able to do that, or they faint, and then they suffocate to death because they can no longer breathe. To be able to cry out in a loud voice is very unusual for a person who's just about to suffocate to death. That he could probably barely whisper. But what Jesus says then, according to Luke's gospel and John's gospel, are these words: "It is finished." That Greek word tetelestai, and it's not a sort of a whimper of defeat. It probably means a number of things that people have thought. It first of all means I have completed everything I came to do, and it is finished. But it's also a Greek term that was a common Greek word. That's in a sense a financial term. When one would borrow a money, or one would have a bill, when one paid the bill or repaid the loan, as sometimes bills or receipts are stamped that say paid or paid in full, they would be signed with this word, which means paid in full. That not only has Jesus completed everything that he came to do, but he has paid in full the debt for the sins of all humanity, once for all time, once for all people. And that is what's partly meant by this word, "it is finished," or these words, "it is finished." One more thing before I leave what was on that slide. Jesus was not killed by Satan on the cross. Those last words of Matthew there, where it says, "and he gave up his spirit," and there are similar words in the other gospels. Jesus was not killed. Jesus gave up his life. It's as if this happened voluntarily. It's not that he was killed and that somehow Satan won, or even thought he should have thought he had won for the time being. But Jesus gave up his life voluntarily. In any case, though, he was dead. And the reactions to his death, there are three reactions here. I'll point these out. The first is the reaction of God, where the reaction of God in the death of his son, killing his son, is that the veil of the temple is torn in two from the top to the bottom. The veil in the temple was a thick, heavy curtain that separated the Holy of Holies, which was thought of as the dwelling place of God on earth, from the holy place, from the rest of the temple. And only the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies, and only once a year with the blood of a goat on the Day of Atonement for the forgiveness of or the rolling back of the sins of Israel for another year. God was on one side, the people were on the other side, and the only one who had access to God was the high priest, and only once a year. The temple being, the veil of the temple being torn in two symbolize the opening of the access to God for everyone for all time, not just for a special priesthood, not just for a select few, but all now had access to God through the death of Jesus. Second, it foreshadows the future destruction of the temple. The veil in the temple was destroyed, and it was destroyed partly to open up access to God, yes, but partly in judgment because of Jesus' rejection by God's people of the old covenant. And as judgment for their rejection of Jesus within that generation, the temple was and the nation were going to be destroyed. So it foreshadows that future destruction. And then, in fact, when it's torn from the top to the bottom, it's a desecration of the temple. That it is as if God has abandoned the temple. You abandoned my son. He is now the way to me, and the temple is no more. It is no more as an avenue to approach me and to reach me and to worship me. So there was God's reaction through the veil to the temple, God's reaction through an earthquake. In an earthquake, in the Old Testament, an earthquake is a symbol of God's judgment in multiple times of God's power and then God's judgment to make the very earth shake and sometimes the rocks to fall on his enemies or the enemies of his people. So again, this refers to the Old Testament. And third, this reference to the resurrections. This is only recorded in Matthew, and we don't know much about the details or the timing. But we do know that this is connected to the resurrection of Jesus later, that Jesus, part of God's reaction to this is that because of what Jesus has done, death no longer has the power that it has had in the past. Then there is the reaction of the soldiers. And the soldiers, when they see all of this happening, because they have to stand here at the foot of the cross with Jesus and the other two criminals until they are dead. When they see the darkness, when they see the storm, see the earthquake, they are frightened and they say, truly, this was the Son of God. This may not necessarily be a Christian confession. It may express their fear and awe as pagan Gentiles. But in the end of Mark's story, or of Matthew's story, at the time of Jesus' death, his title of the Son of God is confirmed even by the pagan Gentiles. They recognize who he was. And then third, the women who've been standing at the cross, who've been watching from a distance. Jesus' disciples, of course, had all fled to save their own lives, all except the Apostle John, who he describes as being here with the ladies. But for the most part, the only ones who are there are the women. And Matthew records no words that they have spoken. He records words of a number of other people, but not from the ladies here. Just he records their love and their faithfulness and their witness to all that has gone on. And they and their love and faithfulness for Jesus are not finished yet. Jesus may have said, it is finished. For his sake, they are not finished, and we will see them later. After Jesus' death, then, Joseph of Arimathea goes to Pilate and asks for the body. And Joseph and then John tells us Nicodemus uh, take Jesus' body and bury it in Joseph's own new tomb. Matthew emphasizes a couple things here, and again, he's very particular with the details that he includes. They're not random details at all. He includes information so that first of all, we know Jesus was really, truly dead. It's not that Jesus has just fainted, that he can be carried away and he'll somehow revive later. Jesus is really, truly dead. And then that Jesus is given a decent and loving burial. This doesn't often happen in the time of Jesus for people who've been crucified. Sometimes the bodies are just left to hang on the crosses until they decay or are eaten by the birds and scavengers. Not only is he given a decent burial, but it's really an extravagant burial. Joseph is a rich person. He's says a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because of the Jews. And he takes Jesus and puts him in his own new tomb that had never been used before. Joseph of Arimathea is mentioned in all four of the Gospels. He's a member of the Sanhedrin. John also mentions Nicodemus, who we had seen in John 3, who came to Jesus by night, who's also a member of the Sanhedrin. And together they take Jesus' body to Joseph's tomb. Matthew includes this, not just for the information's sake, but also as a fulfillment of an Old Testament prophecy from Isaiah 53. They do this. The ladies are there too. The disciples are still hiding in fear. They are of no help at all. The disciples are gone, but the women are there and they are faithful. And Mark and John are careful to say that all of this takes place before sunset, so that Jesus is buried on Friday. He's in the tomb all day Saturday, and then he rises from the dead on Sunday. So Jesus is buried before the Sabbath begins, and then a large stone is used to close the entrance to the tomb. The next day, this is on the Sabbath, this is on Saturday, there's the story about the guards. Now, the guards will be important, of course, in Matthew's account of the resurrection. So here's where they're introduced, and that's why this detail is important to him. Ordinarily, both a visit to Pilate and the sealing of the tomb on a Sabbath day, especially the Sabbath day of a festival, would never have been allowed or considered. The Pharisees or the Jewish chief priests would never have done anything like this. But their hatred of Jesus is so great that they're willing to break their own Sabbath laws and customs in order to go see Pilate, to make sure that no one can say Jesus is risen from the dead. And there's still sort of this uneasy truce between the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the chief priests. They mention 3 days. Now, the only public mention of that, at least recorded in Matthew's gospel, is in the 12th chapter. But Jesus has told his disciples a number of times that after 3 days he will rise again. So it sounds like, from what Matthew has said here, that part of that was common knowledge, or perhaps it came from some of the testimony of the false witnesses and the other witnesses. So they come to Pilate and ask for a guard, and Pilate basically says, you have a guard, or it could be interpreted, take a guard and go take care of it. Could either be Pilate's Roman guard, or it could be their temple guard, but they are being given his official permission to go seal the tomb. and not only to have a guard there, but put a seal on the stone, so the tomb is very secure. It not only has a guard, but an official seal is on the stone, so that one cannot break it. And so we leave Jesus in the tomb. They sent the Roman guard. They are literally in front of the tomb day and night, guarding it so that no one can roll the stone away and get to Jesus or steal his body. And the tomb is officially sealed. And there Jesus is left on Friday and Saturday. I've included here, and I'll encourage you to look at both Isaiah 53 and at Psalm 22. Matthew refers again and again to these two chapters. He refers to other things too, but these are very rich chapters in terms of the prophecy and the detail that they have in 500, 600, 700, 1,000 years before Jesus' crucifixion, before crucifixion was really even used as punishment. What is going to happen to God's Messiah? And it's explained in many details, even up to like at the end of this, where they are casting lots for his garments. So Jesus has been crucified. Matthew has included many details to show specifically all of the things that have happened that fulfill the promises in the Old Testament and the prophecies in the Old Testament that point to Messiah, so that it's very clear, really beyond a shadow of a doubt for him, that Jesus is the only one who could have fulfilled all of this, and it could never have happened by chance. There are simply too many of them. There's one after the other, after the other, after the other. But at this point in the story, Jesus is still in the tomb, and it is Friday evening. But we know the next part of the story, and we know, and Jesus promised. So those there should have known that Jesus will rise from the dead. It is Friday, and it's a dark day, but Sunday is coming. And that will be the subject of our next study when we'll look at Matthew 28. And it will be the last session in this series on the Gospel of Matthew. So please join me for that next section when we look at Jesus' resurrection. Thank you. Until next time.